Welcome to This is What Democracy Sounds Like. I'm Kevin Prang. This program is a presentation of Metropolitan Congregations United. MCU is a community organization that brings together religious congregations, community groups, and individuals to work for a common purpose, to create a better life for all residents of the region. We work at the intersection of race, economy, political power, gender, and the structures of oppression that work within us individually, within our organizations, and within the community. And we're working towards building people's control of the government, building community control of the economy, expanding the public sphere, and creating structural racial equity. Today our guests are Reverend Karen Anderson and Reverend Dietra Wise Baker. Reverend Anderson is the president of the board for MCU, and she is the pastor at Ward Chapel A&E in Florissant. I hope I got that right.
You did.
Reverend Baker is the organizer for MCU's Break the Pipeline campaign, and she's also served as a chaplain for incarcerated youth in St. Louis and convened the MCU's Juvenile Justice Task Force. So welcome both of you. And today we're going to be talking about Metropolitan Congregation United's concrete efforts to break the school-to-prison pipeline. So let's just get started with some definitions. What is the school-to-prison pipeline, and why do we call it that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, MCU's definition has been that it's to end the criminalization of Black youth in three systems: in school systems, in policing, and in the juvenile court system, which all three of those systems can be pre-feeders to kids then going to prison. So that's one definition.
Okay.
And another one is that in recent years, statistics are that for Black youth, they begin to designate as early as third grade which children they think will go to college and which ones they believe will end up in the prison system. And so that's another reason for being called school to prison, is that starting in third grade, they are identifying students that they believe will end up in the system.
Okay, and it tends to have one lead right into the other also, right? It becomes almost a domino effect.
Yes.
Yeah. So how did MCU get involved in this particular issue? Now, MCU's been around for a while, and we've gravitated on this the last few years. What was the process in coming to this?
I think initially it started right after the death of Mike Brown, as MCU began to rethink some of the initiatives that we had. And then based on some of the information that came out of the Ferguson Commission report, we realized that those same three things that Dietra just mentioned, the criminalization of Black youth, the juvenile justice system, the court system, the policing, and education were areas where we might be able to have a significant impact. And so we started out with just some independent task forces, looking at education, looking at police reform, looking at juvenile justice. And from that, we began to develop this whole strategy around ending the school-to-prison pipeline.
Okay, and it sounds like it ended up seeing a lot of overlap then between all of these areas too.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a good example of that, for juvenile court, for example, all referrals from juvenile court come from two places, either from schools or from police. And so, there's the sort of the road or the map. Mm-hmm. So that's a good example of structurally how the school to prison pipeline can work.
Okay. So what are some of the key stakeholders that you try to pull in to and engage in order to change this very large system?
Well, we started with schools, with school districts, talking to administrators concerning their out-of-school suspension policies, talking about the way they handled children who may have been designated as behavioral issues. And so we started by working with school districts and administrators. And then who else? School districts, administrators. That was primarily where we started.
During the public meeting that a lot of folks in the community know about, the regional school assembly that happened a few years back. In that engagement, we were able to engage some more community partners. So Forward Through Ferguson, the ACLU, we formed a coalition called Keep Kids in Class. And so Keep Kids in Class is was a larger group of community stakeholders who all cared about these issues. So it started with school districts and administrators, and Now there's a larger coalition called Keep Kids in Class that's holding this part of the education work.
Okay. So what was the process in starting to have those conversations with the schools? Is it just calling up and saying, hey, we want to talk, or what? I guess I'm trying to get at one of the things that MCU works at is sort of building and expressing agency and power within the community. So how did that start and start to roll and develop when it came to schools?
It started just as you said. We called up and asked for a meeting usually with the school superintendent and whoever her administrative or his administration staff was, and we would go and we presented facts that had to do with out-of-school suspension, the disparities for African American students and white students. We talked about programs that were effective around the country that weren't punitive in nature but more restorative, and began to ask for a commitment from them to do the work. And so honestly, it started by just going from school district to school district and having meetings.
Okay. And what was the response initially?
Yeah, St. Louis Public Schools was the first district to respond, and Dr. Kelvin Adams responding in part to some of his own students who were being organized at the time at MCU. And so Dr. Adams looked at his data. He looked at the faces and testimonies of students who were sharing their experiences. And he was the first superintendent that said, you know what, we're going to put a moratorium on K through third grade suspensions. We're going to stop this and figure out some alternatives. And many folks in the community will remember Norm White and the organization Shut It Down that works with St. Louis Public Schools to provide some of those restorative services on hand so that they could make those changes to their policy.
Okay. Let's get into the issue of out-of-school suspensions. Now, you were talking about K through third graders being suspended from school. It seems a bit harsh for that age. Is it?
I think most of us were shocked when we found that out in this work. I don't think many of us realized that a kindergartner could get suspended. Unfortunately, the data has been clear that especially particularly Black students, K through third grade, were being suspended at very high disproportionate rates. Okay, and suspensions have been around in schools for a long time. So how were suspensions sort of the kickoff point for this pipeline? How does that fit in? Are suspensions being applied differently now, or is it simply a matter of a disparity between who's being suspended?
No, go ahead. That's fine.
No. What I was so I think the answer is there's a larger context to the suspensions, and the Safe Schools Act and that culture that entered the school system, I think, is a part of what have brought the increase in suspensions, and also the presence of police officers in school buildings. And so I think those two policy changes or differences in the school district and that presence together has began to create an elevation and some collateral consequences when it comes to school suspensions. It's almost become almost a no tolerance type of issue, type of thing. Is the Safe Schools Act, is that 90s or early 2000s? 90s. So the Columbine shootings and some of those national events are sort of the precursors to some of these changes in states around the presence of police officers and these sort of zero tolerance policies that have increased, sort of created these environments of zero tolerance and this approach to discipline with students. Okay. So how many school districts have we engaged with, and what are the ones that have made some progress? Well, there's 30 districts in the St. Louis area, and 27 of those districts have made commitments to at least reduce their out-of-school suspensions. So, we've had pretty good engagement with the districts. There's not as many have done moratoriums on K through third grade suspensions, but most of them have committed to decrease their suspensions, and they have. Okay, that's good to hear. Where does this idea of trauma-informed practices come into when we're dealing with discipline issues?
It comes in the fact that understanding that many of the children who attend our schools have a lot of contributing factors to some of the behavior that they exhibit. And so the idea that it is not always just that this is a bad child, but maybe this is a child that needs to learn some behavior modification, how to self-soothe, how to deal with conflict. And so the idea of using trauma-informed care, particularly with schools where children may be in more urban areas, exposed to more trauma, and realizing that there are other ways to deal with kids other than just putting them out of school. And encouraging more counselors. We lost counselors. There was a time when, children were sent to counselors first and evaluations were done, and then maybe they made their way out of school. We've noticed that with cuts, some of the first programs that go were counselors, and just like, athletics and some of the other things that kept kids engaged in school.
Okay, all right. So I'm having a moment here to think things through. So what is sort of the cycle that happens with a child once a suspension happens, an out of school suspension? It seemed in some of the stories I've heard, it sort of builds on itself, and it's hard for the child and the family to get back on track even within the school.
Yeah, you could imagine that out of school suspension, you get behind on your work. Sometimes students have trouble accessing their homework, their tests, and if they're long-term suspension, sometimes students are placed in different schools for periods of time, and the follow-up and the transfer of information is always not efficient. And so, you have students that sometimes get lost in that, and parents that get frustrated, or that might have a lot of other things going on. And so sometimes those kids, that's the beginning of some disinterest sometimes. It can be really hard for a family to continue to navigate through that and push through. So we really need to look at those alternative approaches, because I think everyone, including the educators in our regions, realize that we need to keep the kid in class. We need to keep them in class.
And it becomes a burden for our parents also, especially if parents are working.
Absolutely.
You have to find resources. If the kid's going to not be in school, then that puts an extra pressure on the family too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the potential that they're more likely to come into contact with police, because if they're out of school and maybe there's no supervision and they're on the streets, and that contact can always escalate into something else. And so we want to keep kids in school.
Okay, all right, great. So the trauma-informed practices, we had a little bit of a push in the legislature last year on this. Can you describe some of what we were trying to get?
Yeah, Cora Faith Walker, I think this is the third year that she's introduced legislation to, one, make sure that teachers, when they're getting their certification as teachers, that inclusive of that is that they have to be trauma-informed trained, and that's part of their certification to become teachers. And I think the reason is simple. We have to find alternative ways to do classroom management. You've got kids that are coming in with all kinds of issues, and our first thing can't be to call the police officer to solve that issue. We understand it's sometimes hard for a teacher in a classroom, so let's make sure that teachers have the skills and resources that they need to really get to the why a child is acting out versus the what the child is doing. And so I think that's what trauma-informed practice asks. Why is the kid having a problem, and to get to the root of that instead of just focusing on their behavior.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems like the emphasis then turns to let's love the child instead of go through the policy steps type of thing.
Love the child, and let's do everything we can to keep this kid in school because it's a protective factor for that kid. Yeah.
Understanding, like she said, kids come to school with a lot of issues. Some have not eaten. Some have not slept, and you're asking them to stay awake. You're asking them to concentrate. And even as an adult, when I am short on sleep and short on food, that's a terrible thing to say out loud. When I'm short on sleep and food, my concentration is not as great as it should be. And so we have to look at, as Reverend Dietrich said, what's going on with the child, because it could be so much bigger than anything. several of the school districts, many school districts, have what they call children in transition. Those are children who basically don't have a stable home. So sometimes they're moving every few days. And that's also a reason for sometimes the behavior. And so if we can understand the behavior, then we can do things to help the child be successful in school.
Okay, excellent. Now, you had mentioned more police in the schools, and that's happening more than ever. What are the issues that come up with police officers in the schools?
Well, I mean, the presence of police officers data, clearly indicates that you see, one, an increase in referrals to juvenile detention, not only in our state, but in others. And so just the mere presence, just the difference of not having them in the building decreases referrals. And that's because, officers are still officers inside the building and should really only be referred to for criminal purposes. And so there are lots of advocates around the country, and we are one to remove as many officers out of the building as possible and replace those resources with some of the things we're talking about that are supports for the teachers, counselors, behavioral specialists, other supports, wraparound services at the schools, so that the kid is being met with support and not with handcuffs.
Okay, and that gets back to what you said before. If teachers are overwhelmed and they need to get the situation under control quickly, they know who they can call to get it under control quickly, but that's not necessarily the best. That's not the best person for the situation necessarily.
Yeah, one of the most famous, if you go online, there's a young lady who was, she was sort of tackled, thrown from her desk. She was on her phone. She wouldn't get off her phone. And the school resource officer was called, and she was like thrown and all that. And when the situation was investigated, they found that her mother had died. And so, who knows why she was on the phone, but given that context, someone should have had a conversation with her, someone should have known that, so it makes you ask all kind of questions about what is our engagement with students around discipline. Can we have conversations? Can we talk? Can we offer resources and support versus, aggression and discipline cuffs?
And I think there's been a couple of incidents also with children with special needs where police have come in pretty heavy-handed with children who have special needs, who need people who understand how to deal with children with special needs. Since we've gotten to a point where we incorporate special need children into regular classrooms, then that also means you need someone who understands how to deal with those children. If you have a child who may be on the autism spectrum, they may not want to be touched, and touching may escalate their behavior, or getting too loud with them will escalate their behavior. So we need people in the schools, as Reverend White said, who understand how to wrap around these kids and what are the children's needs. And sometimes it's just to put them in a quiet room.
And there's very specific ways to step down that situation.
To de-escalate situations, yes. And
it seems like there has to be something between, someone being on the phone and someone being thrown. There's a wide spectrum in there that isn't being filled in when it comes to using physical force in addressing a child. So this brings up the idea of, we've been pushing the last couple of years for Memorandum of Understanding with police departments and school districts. What is that Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU, and what does it lay out?
A memorandum of understanding basically clarifies the role of police officers who are in the schools, also known as school resource officers. So one, it specifies the kind of training that they are getting and how often they get it. So making sure that they have developmentally appropriate training for students that they'll be interacting with, special needs training, training that addresses specific school populations. It also clarifies sort of search procedures, so making sure that parent and student rights are protected. If a student is called in and to be questioned, that those rights are being protected, that the school resource officer isn't called in by the principal, for example, and asked a question to the student, and then those answers are then used in official proceedings against the child, so that their rights are protected. Also, things like weapons that officers carry, a use of force protocol, how, when will we discharge weapons, and what kind of weapons are allowed on school property, and when is their use allowed, and that being specified in policy. And then again, clarifying the role of the school resource officer so that there's not this kind of blend of the teacher calling the school resource officer for discipline that the school needs to handle in some alternative manner.
Yeah, being real specific as to when you call in the resource officer, putting some steps in place. Has this child been referred to counselor? Has it gone to maybe you're in high school, I think they have different vice presidents over areas. And then is it time to call in the, school resource officer?
And one of those being if a crime
If a
is
crime, yes.
committed, and not just being on the phone during class.
Right.
Yeah. And so how many districts have we talked to, and what's been the progress on MOUs?
We've been in conversation with about 4 districts and another 3 this year. It's a long process. They see that document. They're used to 1-page sort of MOUs that describe sort of a contract, and so it's hard for them to wrap their head around the community being involved and asking all these questions. And but we're starting to get there. So we need. We have 30 districts and we have 7 that we're in conversation with. So there's lots of work to be done there.
Okay, great.
And parents have been very helpful. Engaging parents in this process and allowing them at times to be the voice even more so than MCU's voice. Organizing and training and preparing parents to be the ones who sit with administrators and attend school board meetings and ask for the things that we're talking about. So engaging parents, I know we talked about stakeholders earlier, and I think it just kind of slipped, but one of the primary stakeholders is the parents in the school districts.
They have the best voice when
they have the best voice.
Right. Let's go ahead and move on to the juvenile justice system. If a young person is finding themselves in the court system, what kind of challenges might they face? And I'll roll in one of the other questions too. Are there any sort of basic advice for a family that's finding themselves in that situation?
So obviously this is a complicated system. It's very different than the adult criminal system, the juvenile justice system. And so the first thing is to make sure they have legal representation. It's the first thing that we talk to parents and youth about really early on, because kids can be arrested and have police contact and not realize that they are in sort of a criminal proceeding because they're dealing with, juvenile officers who are, half probation officer, half social worker. And so it may not be clear to the family that, no, you're dealing with an official of the court. And so really right up front, parents and youth, when they have police contact, they have juvenile court contact, they need legal representation either through their public defender's office or private.
And it seems like parents, when they're in that situation, they feel overwhelmed, and there's sort of this impetus to let's get through this quickly so we can get back on track. And understanding that sort of the system has its own schedule, and it may not be in your wheelhouse or your interest that system is moving on. So you need that representation.
Absolutely. As you can manage, there's lots of actors and people that the parents don't know or how to navigate. The parents don't know their rights. The kids don't know their rights. And so there's a lot that's at stake, particularly early in that process. And so it's really important for parents and families to get representation early and support early.
And what kind of changes has MCU been working on with juvenile courts, and what's kind of been the progress so far?
Yeah, early on, St. Louis County Court, for example, had a Department of Justice investigation, and some of the calls, one of them was to increase legal representation from the court side and to provide, at that time there was 400 or so juvenile cases and 1 lawyer for those kids. So that was a problem, 1 public defender, and as we know, the public defender office is underfunded, and so we were asking the county to provide an additional lawyer, which they did, that they pay out of the county's budget, and so there's 2. There's 2 now, lawyers, and there's been some money from the public defender's office to get some more representation. So we're headed in the right direction there. There's also some problems with racial disparity, and so the court was asked to engage in a process, which they are in, with the Annie Casey Foundation to look deeply into the issues of racial bias and implicit bias in the court practices. And so they're deeply in that, and we've been involved with them in that process. And then finally, I would say having community engagement, making sure that the community is involved, community has a voice, parent and youth engagement, and the court's culture has opened up to that in ways that it wasn't before. And so there's lots more to do, but we're starting to build the kind of relationships to build the kind of juvenile justice system that we need from Missouri.
Excellent. And just I want to touch quickly on one of our newer initiatives, is the Family Engagement Partners. What is that, and how can families reach out to that?
Yeah, the family.
Talk about your baby.
The Family Partner Campaign is really just like we talked about earlier. Families can connect to MCU, call our office, email us, Facebook us, and tell us, hey, if your kid's been suspended, if your kid's been expelled, if your kid's had contact with the police, if they're in juvenile detention, reach out to us. It's real simple. We want to make sure that you have representation, that you know your rights, and that you have a partner as you go through navigating the juvenile justice system or getting your kid back in school.
Okay, excellent. We're running out of time here. I just want to open up for any final thoughts on MCU and what we're doing here. I think one of the neat things is that we're actually putting this all into action. It's one step at a time, but we're starting to see some progress.
Absolutely. We know that nothing changes overnight, but we are committed. This is the primary focus of MCU, and so everything that we do, and every time somebody comes to ask us to be involved, we always put it against the lens of, does this build into what we're already doing? And so we are absolutely committed to seeing this through to a point where not just K through third grade has changed with out-of-school suspensions, but we move on through middle school and high school, so that we build a better school system all the way around for our students. So other than that, for me, it's just, we need people.
Yeah. Parents
youth. And youth, anybody that's even somewhat interested to engage with us. We are more than willing and open to have as much input as we can get.
I think that building the power of the parents is one of the things that's key. We've had a lot of us that show up to our monthly meetings, but not necessarily the ones most affected. So having those parents involved and that they understand that they have resources and they have power that they can exercise is really good. I think that's going to just about wrap it up. I want to thank our guests today, Reverend Karen Anderson and Reverend Deetra Wise Baker. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
To find out more about the Break the Pipeline campaign, go to the Metropolitan Congregations United website. That's mcustlewis.org. Also, be sure to follow us on Facebook, and also this one is being Facebook Live, so that's something you can check out online too. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and events. And if you want to participate with us, please come on out to one of our monthly mass meetings every third Tuesday of the month. And you can find details on the website about exact time and place, and also our social media outlets. I'm Kevin Prang, and you have been listening to This Is What Democracy Sounds Like. Tune in again next time, and thank you for listening.